Working Cows Podcast, episode 316. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag. Very excited to have getting back to, after taking July off, getting back to releasing some of these bonus episodes with Understanding Ag and their instructors and educators. And very excited to welcome back to the show today Morgan Hartman. And Morgan is a guy that knows genetics very well, and look forward to maybe having a conversation about that with him in the future. But he's also a guy who has been in the turf management industry for a long time. And turf management in this country is something that sometimes goes overlooked and doesn't get paid attention to as far as the way that chemicals and different things are used. And it tends to be one of those things where people can say there isn't a lot of good ways to approach soil health from this perspective because of these and those limiting factors and circumstances. So we're going to talk to Morgan today about how do we do that? How do we approach this from a soil health perspective? But first, it's episode 316. I want to read John 3:16 for you today. So, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So, kind of the gospel in a verse. Been a loved verse for a long time in church history. And if you have any questions about what all that means, I encourage you to reach out to me. Email me at workingcows.net/contact, workingcows.net/contact, and we'll try to initiate that conversation. But for now, very excited to welcome back to the show, Morgan Hartman. Morgan, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you, Clay. It's a pleasure to be here.
I will never forget the first time we recorded a podcast episode together, because I was sitting along Highway 85, somewhere between Belfield, North Dakota, and Watford City, North Dakota, and it was a rainstorm, and I'd had your name on a list from somebody who sent me a list of guests I should interview, some of which I've gotten to, some of which I haven't yet, but names that continue to cross my mind and think, oh yeah, I should reach out to them again and have them back on. And so I was glad to have this opportunity facilitated by Understanding Ag to chat with you again. And so looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to go a little bit different direction today with the Working Cows Podcast conversation, but I'm totally in favor of that. I always like to challenge my own paradigms and get outside my comfort zone and talk about things that I don't know much about, and that presents an opportunity for me to learn. And so today I think our focus is going to be on turf management and how we can apply the 6, the 3, and the 4 to turf management. Is that your understanding of where we're headed today?
It is, yeah. And it's got, no pun intended, but it's got its roots in agriculture.
So where do we start? I mean, on this conversation, as far as kind of, I think maybe the place to start, if I may, is to say, what is the current state, or what has been the state of turf management in the United States, that as you are aware of it?
In the United States, there's been a huge influence by the golf industry. You know, when people started watching golf on television, Saturday afternoon, Sunday afternoon, what have you, they're seeing these manicured horses. And they say, oh my goodness, I would love to have that at my home. And the thing is that that's management intensive work, and often chemical intensive work, to keep a place looking as good as it does at Augusta National or Pebble Beach or any of these places. And the thing too to remember is those lawns that we call golf courses are not necessarily fitting into the context in which they exist. Maybe Augusta National is a little closer than Pebble Beach, but Pebble Beach is a dry climate, right? So how do you keep that grass green? You have to pump a lot of water onto it. And as we know, California in particular has a history of drought, and it's only getting worse as people demand more water to keep their lawns green.
Yeah, and I think that there are some interesting statistics that go along with that, and kind of just to put things in perspective, and I think it's a fair point that we don't necessarily want to just point the finger. When somebody points a finger at agriculture, we don't necessarily just want to point a finger back. We need to recognize that there's a reason they're pointing a finger at us, but also just to put it in perspective, kind of give me a summary, as you understand it, of the acres of lawn in this country, and then kind of the nutrients and the resources that it requires to manage the lawn in such a way that you can make sure the Joneses next door are a little bit jealous of your lawn.
Yeah, certainly. Well, so according to the Turfgrass Trade Association, and I forget their actual name right now, but there's roughly 44 million acres of turf in the form of residential lawns, commercial lawns, sports fields, and golf courses in the United States. That 44 million acres of grass is the most heavily irrigated crop in the United States, right up there with corn. On a per acre basis, lawns, including those sports fields and so on, receive 10 times the rate of fertilizer, fungicide, herbicide, pesticide application as the next closest agricultural crop. So when we think about soil health in a residential setting, for the most part, the soils are engineered, meaning when you have a housing development, they dig up subsoil, they're bringing in materials from outside. It all gets kind of blended together, compacted heavily. And it doesn't create, you don't have healthy living soil. You have a compacted substrate that is simply there to hold the grass up, right? And then we have to treat in all sorts of ways. That phrase, better living through chemistry, that some drug addicts use, that's right where our soils are. They're at the level of addiction to nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, because they're not alive. And we see it both in the agricultural setting and, of course, in the residential setting.
Yeah, and I just looked up the USDA statistics say that there's 92 million acres of corn, and you're saying that the 44 million acres of lawn receive roughly the same amount of irrigation, or maybe even a little bit more. And just, I mean, think about that. And maybe I'm thinking about this the wrong way, but think about that and the fact that I think east of the 100th meridian, you just keep gaining more and more rainfall, and more of that corn is essentially dryland corn, if I'm not mistaken. It's not irrigated.
Correct,
it's rained on. They actually get rain there.
Right.
And so you just think about that, the fact that probably, I would say, I don't know, this is just a stab in the dark, but the majority of bushels harvested in this country might not get irrigated at all, or at least lot of the bushels of corn harvested in this country might not get irrigated at all. Now put that into perspective, comparing it to grass and the way that we're managing that becomes an even more stark contrast.
right? And then think too about the herbicides, the pesticides, uh, fungicides, etc. And when the statistic is 10 times on a per acre basis to the next closest crop, which is corn, that's pretty scary because you have those compacted soils. And when we do have a rain event, where's that water going? It goes right to the storm drain. And from there, it's ending up in our waterways. It's ending up in our drinking water. And it's inevitably landing in the Great Lakes, the oceans, and so on.
Well, and that's the function or the lack of function of dead soils, not healthy living soils, is that they don't infiltrate water. And so,
that's right.
And probably my guess, I mean, Kentucky bluegrass, it's a invasive species in my part of the world. And one of the big problems with it is that it is gets started early, it's early maturing, and it's shallow rooted. Well, that's a great recipe for a lawn, but it's a terrible recipe for water infiltration. And so you're compounding the issues of you've got all of this chemical sitting right there on top of it, and then on top of your lawn, and then the rain comes and washes those chemicals away. And so, I mean, those are you just keep on heaping on these issues with how kind of lawn is managed or turf is managed in this country by and large.
That's right. And when you think about too the 634, the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes, the term diversity shows up in the 6 principles and in the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship. So must be diversity is important, right? And to your point about Kentucky bluegrass, it is the most planted lawn grass, at least in the northern tier of the United States. And then you've got zoysia and Bermuda grass in the south. I'm not sure what would be grown in your part of the country, but if Kentucky blue is an invasive species, my guess is it started out as a lawn someplace.
Yep, it is. That's what we have is Kentucky bluegrass. All the whenever you go to a farm store and they've got lawn grass seed, it's Kentucky bluegrass. That's what grows here.
Yeah, and it grows there because it gets irrigated and it gets sprayed and it get all those things.
We pretend we're living in Kentucky, at least in the half acre around our house, and we irrigate.
That's right,
and it works.
And that's a great point, right? So if you got 44 million acres of lawn, the bulk of that is going to be in half acre increments or smaller, maybe even, right? Because you're in densely populated areas. I recently had the opportunity to drive in 3 days. I made it from Portland, Oregon to back home in Western Massachusetts, and driving along I-84 and I-80. That's a tremendous transect of the northern tier of the United States. And the things I saw were monocrop corn, monocrop Kentucky blue, monocrop soybeans, monocrop ryegrass, perennial ryegrass as a lawn, right? Those are the things I was seeing. And there's not a lot of difference between monocrop corn in Iowa and monocrop Kentucky blue in upstate New York or Virginia. The effects are the same on the soil. The runoff effects are the same. So we really need to think about turfgrass management in the exact same way that we think about the soils under our crop ground.
Yeah, and I think that's a great segue because I think we could probably continue to heap on on turf management, and we could probably continue to heap on monocrop management if we wanted to. But I think more to the point of this conversation is, how do we chart a better path forward? What does it look like to implement the 6, the 3, and the 4 in your lawn, on your turf, at the golf course in your county or your neighborhood, what does the 6, the 3, and the 4 look like when it comes to those places?
Right off the bat, we have to look at context. We're looking at massively high temperatures day on, week on end in Arizona, in New Mexico, in the four corner states, but also all the way up into Oregon and Washington, into Montana, across the Southeast. We've seen it some here in the Northeast. So what is that context? And does a green lawn in central Montana or in Phoenix make sense? How do we do that without a massive use of water?
Yeah.
So
I
we
know
look at the context.
Yeah. I mean, I know a lot of people in Arizona they just give up on the idea of a lawn. They have gravel or something like that, But then I also know the other side of that, the flip side of that. I know a lot of people who go to Arizona to play golf in the winter from South Dakota. I know some people who retired to Arizona primarily because of the golfing that was there. And so we're clashing contexts there.
Absolutely.
Keeping something green in that part of the world year round is going to require a lot of water.
And it's funny in terms of implementing the 634 in a turf scenario. Yes, we look at the context. Does the golf course, a green grass golf course in Arizona, make sense? The game of golf was developed in Scotland. It's a little more damp in Scotland on the coast, St.
Andrews,
and it
gets a little more rain than Phoenix.
Absolutely.
Generally.
And the high temperatures are not all that high. But those were sheep pastures that were cropped very close. And so that's where we get the concept of a sand trap, because these were sheep pastures on beaches, essentially. And so we get the sand traps, we get the greens where the grass is cropped very close by the sheep. But those greens had animal impact, right? The sheep weren't there all the time. They were there, they did their business, and they moved on. And after the sheep were off, that's when you started knocking golf balls around. But that is not what happens in Arizona or South Florida. There's a gentleman that got to meet through Understanding Ag. He's a nursery producer, tree nursery producer down near Homestead, Florida. And he was invited in to help oversee the construction of a new golf course. So when I was talking about engineered soils in our lawns, golf courses are the epitome of engineered soils. And he said, hey, folks, to the golf course architects, instead of white sugar sand as the base with 3 inches of topsoil with some organic matter above, and then that is sown to zoysia grass, why don't we mix the top 6 inches of sand and topsoil together and then sow that to the zoysia grass? And he created a test plot and showed side by side, when you have the white sugar sand below the topsoil, the roots of that zoysia grass go down 3 inches, they hit the sugar sand, and they make a left turn. They go 90 degrees. They do not penetrate that sand. When you have that 6 inches mixed, now you've got diversity, you have water infiltration, and those roots go straight down 6 inches. So the water holding capacity and the nutrient holding capacity goes up, which automatically means you're watering less and you're putting fewer synthetic fertilizers down.
So that's great. Great option. Great way to look at it from a different perspective. Are there some places, though, that I don't know how to say this? Are there some places that just shouldn't have a golf course?
Yes, as a matter of fact. And I have nothing against golf. I mean, it's wonderful. People get outside. Often they're walking. They're spending time in nature that they would not otherwise do, because we truly do have an urbanized society today. So I'm all for it, right? But let's start thinking about ways in which we can incorporate the context. You mentioned earlier when we were talking before we got on, Fernando Falamir is in the Chihuahuan Desert, and he's growing grass when nobody else around him is, because he's changed his management to fit the context, and he's restoring grassland. He's restoring the water cycle. And so maybe the question isn't, should we not have a golf course here? But how do we manage it? How do we design it? And then how do we manage it? If it's in the greater Phoenix area, or if it's outside Miami, or if it's in Alberta, Canada, right? The context is different. And so we have to then apply these principles and rules to fully enhance and work with the ecosystem processes that we've been given.
Yep. I was just telling you about my my foibles in podcasting earlier today. And so this is probably would have been a great first question to ask somebody. But what is your unique qualification to speak to this issue? What's kind of the set of experiences that set you up to speak to turf grass management and soil health and the way that we mesh those two things together?
Well, I was doing construction work down on Long Island, New York. Not exactly the most rural area in the country. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, you really enjoy this work, but you also really enjoy science. Maybe you'd like the horticulture program at Farmingdale State." I looked into it. I enrolled. I did absolutely love it. From there, I transferred up to Cornell University. Ended up with a bachelor's degree in ornamental horticulture, natural resource management, and landscape design. That was 25 plus or minus years ago. In between then and now, I've worked in the landscape design build industry, landscape management, and also in agriculture. I was raising grass-fed beef, registered Angus breeding stock. And so I fit into that confluence of the rural and the urban, and I see the similarities that maybe some folks don't between the built environment and the more natural environment.
Sure. And if I'm not mistaken, there would have been in your grass-fed beef and the selection of those critters, there would have been some influence of like Jan Bonsma and some of those guys. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's kind of where you were coming from on that. Just wanted to clear that up because honestly, in at episode 99, last time I had you on the podcast, I didn't know enough to ask that question. So it's just a part of my learning journey.
Yeah. No worries.
But anyways, so that kind of sets the stage for how we can start charting a better path forward. You said context is the big one. And I think that, right, wrong, or indifferent, golf courses are going to exist. And so there's probably a way to fit them into the context that they're in a way that requires less inputs than if we just forced it to happen somewhere else. Or, if we said it's happening here no matter what, versus this spot actually is going to allow us to trap some runoff or whatever that we can later use for watering or whatever that context piece looks like. But there's some of those considerations. Would you agree with that?
100%, sure. And, obviously, if you can get in at the design phase and implement the principles, the 634, into that design phase, well, then the management is proactive, not retroactive, right? You're doing it from the beginning. While in school on Long Island, I had the opportunity to do a 2-year internship on a golf course. And where this course has very heavy clay soil on the north shore of Long Island. You go to the south shore and it's sugar sand. So you've got these greens that were constructed on heavy clay, and the answer at that time was to cut drainage in and essentially tile, just like you would a farm field, tile the greens, tile the fairways, tile the tees, and drain that water away. Get it as far away from that course as possible, and then use municipal water to irrigate. And that made no sense to me. Just not that I had experience in ag or regenerative, sustainable agriculture at all at that point. It just didn't make sense to remove a resource as precious as water and then replace it with municipal water to keep everything green. So, looking back at it, are there things that we could have done even in that case where you have an existing course or an existing lawn at home? If you're on a heavy compacted soil, or if you're on a very sandy, loamy soil, you can do things like add compost in the spring and in the fall. You're adding organic matter. You can, if it's your home lawn, you can capture all of the lawn cuttings, you bag your cuttings, start your own compost pile, and your coffee grounds and all those things go out there, and some people put them in their garden. You can do the same principles apply to your lawn. Looking at diversity again, trying to get plant species, multiple plant species, whether it's more species of grass, yes, that's good, but preferably you would want representatives of the grasses, legumes, and forbs. And there are cultivated varieties of those species that can work very well on a golf green. Or if not on the green, at least on the fairway. And you've always got that space in the rough. For a while here recently, the last couple of years, the folks have pushed the concept of the no mow May, right? Let your lawn grow because it's so good for the pollinators. I don't know about you, but I have not seen many honeybees on Kentucky blue, right? It just don't show up. If you have some Dutch white clover in there, yeah, you'll get some honeybees. A better alternative is to sow in other seed and allow, whether it's wild thyme, wild oregano, that, I don't like having that in my lawn. It doesn't look like Augusta National. Well, but those plants can handle low water situations. They can handle a diversity of climatic events, and they're flowering plants. So if we want to support pollinators, whether it's bees or moths and butterflies and so on, let's have some of those flowering plants in our lawns, not just in the flower bed. And we can do that on the golf course in the rough, especially utilizing natives.
We've talked about context and we've talked about diversity. And one of the 6 principles of soil health is to reduce disturbance. And I think probably understanding ag was one of the first ones that I heard say not just mechanical disturbance, but also chemical disturbance. And I think that it's easy to forget about that one because it's less obvious. But talk about some of the ways that we can reduce that chemical disturbance on these acres of lawn and turf in this country.
Sure. Well, let's go back to the compost idea, right? When we add compost, we're adding carbon, we're adding nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, so on. We're also adding a living inoculant, right? Because in order to compost, you have an aerobic process. Fungi are involved, bacteria are involved, protozoa are involved. So you've got a diversity of microorganisms that you're inoculating your lawn with. And when you stop or drastically reduce your spray regimen, those microorganisms stay alive and they become incorporated into your lawn. And as the lawn soil becomes more alive, you get aggregation, which means you've got water infiltration, air infiltration, and you go from an anaerobic situation to an aerobic situation. Roots go deeper. The plants are less stressed. They can, because they've got the mycorrhizal associations, they're able to take up nutrients in ways that they can't when it's just the plant root in the absence of that mycorrhizal association. So you don't have to put the fertilizers down. And because the plants are less stressed, their immune response to fungi and pathogens is much stronger. They can handle those insults. And so it's just what God gave us in terms of a natural cycle. When we get out of the way, and I'm paraphrasing Gabe here, when we get out of the way and allow nature to self-heal, self-regulate, and we work with nature, most of the problems that we are treating are just symptoms, and they go away.
Yep. Yeah. It's run through my mind a few times recently, but the phrase is ranching according to what God provides. And
yeah.
if he's not providing it here at this moment naturally, then it's going to cost me probably in compounding and cascading ways to get it here,
Yeah.
And so we should really think hard, long and hard before we do something that the system that God designed isn't providing at this moment. And I think that's, goes back to something that I think comes up in almost every one of these episodes is humility. We got to be willing to say, okay, I know this is the way that we've always done it, but let's think about a different way of doing it and not assume that we're right and look at different options and try to figure out other ways to do it. So yeah, I think that's an important one for sure.
I'm sorry, you brought up Fernando. And of course there he is ranching in the Chihuahuan Desert. He gets rain when nobody else does because he has forage growing. There's armor on the soil. He's dealing with transpiration, not evaporation. And so that precious resource that was given to us, that water, is supplied because he's working with that design.
Yeah. One of the rules of stockmanship is good movement draws good movement. And I think moisture draws moisture. And you've seen the pictures, and you the first time you see the picture, you assume, well, that's fake or that's photoshopped or that's not real. Of right down the fence line, desert on this side. It's not lush and green necessarily, but there's at least forage standing out there on this side of and there's a rain cloud coming, and it's wispy and weak on the side of the desert, and right on the other side of the fence, you can see it's raining already. And I mean, like I said, it looks fake. You assume it's probably not real the first time you see it, but then the more you learn about these things, the more you realize they've got something out there to draw that moisture. And a good friend of mine, Bart Carmichael, would say, on 5,000 acres, and I'm sure it's smaller than that in some contexts, but in our context, if you've got 5,000 acres, you can influence the weather and the way the rain patterns and the clouds develop and attract that moisture. So again, it sounds out there. It challenges my paradigms, but I think it's true. I think it really does work that way. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room of integrating livestock on these acres. And let me just say, at my house, the most high density grazing we do every year is in our yard, and it's bum lambs in a pen that is probably 4 feet by 10 feet, or at the biggest 10 feet by 10 feet. But that's the most high density grazing we do every year. When you talk about the cows we bring in and the horses and the sheep, the most high density grazing we do every year is in our yard with bum lambs in a pen that we move multiple times a day. So,
yeah. Well, the origin of the lawn, right, is actually just what you're describing. It is the diversified farmstead, and people had chickens outside. They had sheep, they had cattle, they had horses. And those animals had to be moved around. And in the areas immediately around the house, you would typically also have trees. So you get some shade, you get some diversity in your plant canopy. You get that diversity of the livestock, and you're going to have that grass. The origin of the game of golf, sheep pastures. Humans, we are pastoralists. We are farmers. Even if we're working on Wall Street, that's where we came from. And so that's where we also want to return to, which is why people go out and play golf. That's why they want to have their lawn on their quarter acre, their half acre, look verdant and green, regardless of where they live. We people want that connection. What we've lost is the knowledge of how to get there. And it's really in working with nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched on diversity. We've touched on integration of livestock. We've touched on the reducing of disturbance and a context. So, I mean, and I suppose living roots in the soil and minimizing, and then the armor on the soil, we've kind of touched on those too. So would you like to say more about any of those as far as the 6, the 3, and the 4 goes with our lawns and with the turf in our country?
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that happened, you can almost mark it on your calendar. It happened in 2003 when there was this blow up in the news about BSE, right? And so people started wanting to know where their food came from. All of a sudden, in suburban neighborhoods, you've got small flocks of chickens because people wanted to know where those eggs were coming from. And they're like, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. You mean I can get eggs for quote unquote free while they're out eating around on my lawn? Well, how much do you think they started thinking about what got sprayed on their lawn before those chickens started eating? All of a sudden, people started thinking about that too. And so there's been that, you mentioned it before, cascading compounding effects. So there is some integration of livestock, even in very suburban and sometimes urban areas, whether it's chickens. Occasionally you'll see a small ruminant here or there, but by and large, it's going to be chicken, poultry and fowl, because those are the critters that can be in the most confined space. But it is happening.
So I don't know. I haven't prepared you for this exercise, but I would like to give you the opportunity to lay out a well thought out design for. You can start with a lawn, or if you want to go, up to the higher level, well thought out design for a golf course. I mean, talk about context, talk about how you would choose all of those things and integrate livestock into some of those areas. And would that be a helpful exercise to help kind of wrap up and
Sure.
as we think about these things?
Sure, certainly. And we can really look at the design for the golf course and the lawn in the same way, right? Your home has just been built. You've had dozers and excavators and loaders and stuff all over around the home. Things are highly compacted. Subsoil's been brought up to the surface. Instead of simply putting a cap, a few inches of dark, what we're going to call topsoil, why not put that at a depth of 4 inches and have it mechanically rototilled in so that you don't have that line, that demarcation line, that soil horizon of highly compacted subsoil, and then this fluffy 3-inch or 4-inch layer of quote unquote topsoil. Oftentimes what we find as topsoil is sandy loam that's been mixed with some malorganite or some highly nutritious, we'll say, organic compounds. But if that's rototilled in, mechanically incorporated, and allowed to settle just from some rain, and it's maybe a light roller goes over top of it, and seeded to a diversity of seed, a diversity of plants. And then there's straw put down, or it could be shredded newspaper. It could be, things like that, to put the armor on the soil right from the beginning and allow that to grow naturally. So if you've got a cocktail mix, just like with a cover crop of 14 different species, then the plants that will survive, that can handle the regimen that you're in, will do just that. And they will thrive. And you have the diversity of root types, root depths, and the inherent mycorrhizal, microbial relationships. So you have a living lawn, a living soil. And that you can do exactly the same thing on a golf course. The golf course actually gives you more, because it's going to be a larger acreage, it gives you more flexibility to incorporate poultry, fowl, small ruminants at different times of the year. There are going to be periods of the year where maybe that golf course should be dormant, right? In the Northeast, where I am, it's going to be the winter. Can you incorporate livestock when the ground is frozen and get that animal impact and get them off before it thaws out, whether it is small ruminants or whatever, and get them off, and then incorporate a composting system that is developed on site, because you're mowing typically every day. Start composting the cuttings, leaves, et cetera, and so forth. And then apply that spring, summer, fall, and then incorporate the livestock again. So that's a thumbnail sketch, but that's something that can readily be done.
So, a couple of things that come to my mind. First of all, there's people that pay good money or bad money, I don't know, depending on how you're going to classify it, to do yoga with a goat. So there's got to be somebody who would pay to play golf with a sheep grazing in the rough next door. And then, and then here's the other thing that I think of. What if we just built a 19-hole golf course? And I'm not talking about the 19th hole being the bar at the end of the,
Right.
What if we built a 19-hole golf course and every day one of those holes was shut down because there was livestock integrated onto the fairway, the green, the tee box, the rough, all of it.
Yep.
What if we just something like that? I don't, I'm sure that's some sin about the playability of a golf course and, whatever. I don't know, but those are some of the things that spring to my mind from this conversation.
Absolutely. And when you think about the larger courses, I'm thinking of Bethpage down on Long Island. You've actually got 36 holes, 72 holes. Rotate, right? Give the first 18 a rest for 3 weeks, 4 weeks. So there's that rule of disruption, right? And we've already minimized the disturbance, but now we can incorporate the differing rest periods. We can alter mowing heights. We can alter our chemical regime of synthetics. And when we do that, we actually build a more resilient system. And like I said, I'm sure, you asked the question, would people pay more to have sheep in the rough? I absolutely believe they would. I mean, there are always going to be those folks who are like, oh my good, I'm not going to, but by and large, you're going to get oh my gosh, they're so cute, and again, we are hardwired to participate in life with animals, not just dogs and cats, but all sorts of animals. And there's a benefit to spending that time out in nature, hearing birds sing, hearing lambs bleat. And I think absolutely it'd be a good pitch.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally doable. So Mike, I guess kind of as we point towards wrapping up here, is there anybody doing this? I'm sure there's lots of people doing it, but can you give me some examples of I'd love to hear an example of a golf course implementing these ideas, but of some people, and we've talked about some of the integration of chickens and small ruminants, but just can you give me some examples of these ideas being adopted on a broader scale?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of firsthand knowledge, but Understanding Ag has started writing articles in collaboration with a blog called Driving the Green, which is all about sustainability in golf, really with a focus on municipally owned courses. And there are 3 courses in the Washington, D.C. area, one of which I believe is associated with the University of the District of Columbia, which is a traditionally black college, university. They have a research farm. I think it's about 130, 140 acres. And they do all kinds of things with livestock. And one of the producers of the blog, of the Driving the Green blog, Andrew Shunjog, has talked about how they are now incorporating sheep in the rough on at least one of those municipal golf courses right in the heart of Washington, D.C. I believe there are several others across the country that have, these guys have related to me. I couldn't tell you specifically which ones they are.
Well, and I mean, if the sheep are grazing in an electric net fence, it's incentive not to hit your ball into the rough.
Think how much people's game is going to improve.
Yeah, this is really for you. It's for your benefit. Promise.
That's right.
Very good. Well, if I'm reading the schedule right, at Understanding Ag, October 3rd through the 5th, you will be in New York,
yes,
near Albany, not very far outside of Albany, so not hard to get there if you were looking. And you'll be doing a course be participating in a course on, is it regenerative dairying or something along those lines?
Yeah. So the Soil Health Academy that we're doing at High Meadows of Hoosick is about 45 minutes from Albany. 20 minutes from Bennington, Vermont. so it's pretty centrally isolated. It is easy to get to, but we're doing this on a dairy with the understanding, and no pun intended, but with the understanding that the fundamentals of soil health, the 634, has broad application. And we can certainly see on a dairy farm where cows are being grazed. I mean, they milk 220 to 250 cows. Those cows are being grazed every day, a portion of every day. They're not 100% grass-fed, but real close. But the fundamentals, it's the principles that matter. And they matter in a tree nursery in the same way that they do on a dairy farm, in the same way they do on a stock operation. And it's understanding that each context is going to be unique to itself. And from there, that first principle of soil health, all the other pieces fall into place.
And to maybe give some people some more incentive to go there. Two things that I can think of. First of all, you're real close, if not right in the middle of peak color season in that part of the world. And another thing that I learned about when I went to upstate New York in late September was cider donuts, which, you should go for the cider donuts, if nothing else, right?
That's right. Cider donuts, caramel apples. There's usually some really good maple syrup kicking around, and the color. I mean, it's absolutely, the leaf peepers, the folks that come into town for that time of year. It's fantastic. You don't necessarily want to be here in January, but that first week in October is real nice.
Yeah, the snow tends to pile up in that part of the world too, huh?
It does.
No, I think it'd be great, and maybe I'll get to sneak out there for that. That'd be awesome to take that in, because there's a lot of things drawing me to that part of the world at that time of the year. So, especially with the Soil Health Academy being there, so that'd be cool. Anything we missed? Anything else you wanted to cover here as far as lawn and turf management or Soil Health Academy or anything like that?
I will throw in about the Soil Health Academy in New York State. Of course, Soil Health Academy itself as an organization has a fertile fields or battlefields to fertile fields program for veterans. And for this particular Soil Health Academy in New York State, they're partnering with the New York State Farm Ops, which is administered by the Cornell Small Farms Program, and it builds that bridge between, or that transition period between active service in the military and getting into agriculture. And so they have scholarships available, and they're partnering with Soil Health Academy to make it so that veterans from New York State pay $125, and that's it out of the $1,375. It's a pretty big deal.
That is cool. Very cool. Links to all that will be in the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/316. workingcows.net/316 will be the show notes page for today. So would encourage you to go check that out and get signed up to be there. Morgan, if there's nothing else, I'll just say thank you for your time today.
Yeah. Thank you, Clay. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, sir.
Well, I really enjoyed that conversation. Morgan, obviously a sharp guy and has a lot of experience and great perspective and willingness to think outside the box about the solution to these issues. Recognize this episode was a little late coming out, so tomorrow, Lord willing, I'll have an episode coming out for episode 317 of the Working Cows podcast. Looking forward to sharing with you my interview with Austin Manis, and he is from a company called Harvest Returns. And what Harvest Returns is doing is trying to rethink the way that financing is done in agriculture and bringing some of that more venture capital type of a strategy into the fundraising for agriculture and agricultural enterprises. So really looking forward to shaking things up a little bit and challenging some paradigms in the way that these things are handled. So look forward to that episode coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows Podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.